The seller happens to be out of town and asks if the agent could just change the price immediately, and then the seller will sign the change form in a week. If the agent changes the price without the written consent of the seller, they have violated the administrative rules. Purchasing property. If an active licensee wishes to advertise that they will buy or rent property, all advertisements must contain the name of the licensee's principal broker as reflected on division records. Double commissions. We review the details of a listing agreement in another course. In most listing agreements, the seller agrees to pay the listing broker a commission when the property sells. Usually, the listing broker then agrees to market the property to other brokers, typically through a multiple listing service, MLS. The listing broker then agrees to split the commission being paid by the seller with any other broker who might bring the buyer. Let's look at what could happen if another broker representing a buyer went directly to the seller rather than going through the listing broker. If another broker goes directly to the seller, the broker will most likely negotiate a commission agreed directly with the seller. The broker then negotiates a purchase contract between the buyer and the seller. What is the problem? The listing agreement with the original broker most likely says the seller will pay the broker commission when the property sells. The agreement usually does not say the broker will be paid if the broker brings a buyer. It simply states the seller will pay the broker when the property sells. When the new broker signs a commission agreement with the seller, they have now subjected the seller to pay double commissions. The seller must pay the new broker under the new agreement and must also pay the listing broker under the original listing agreement. Subjecting the seller to a double commission situation is against the rules. It is also against the rules to go directly to the seller when the seller already has an agreement with another broker. In fact, it is against the rules to enter or attempt to enter an agreement with any buyer, seller, lessor, or lessee when the licensee knows or should know that the client is already subject to another agreement with another licensee. Receiving referral fees. We cover the prohibition against paying referral fees in another course. Remember, a licensee may not pay a referral fee unless the compensation is valued at $150 or less for an unsolicited referral. It is also against the rules for a licensee to accept a referral fee from a mortgage lender. Referral fees from lenders are also restricted under the Federal Real Estate Settlement Procedures Act. Agency agreements. Before a licensee represents a client, administrative rules require the licensee and the client have an agreement in writing defining the relationship between the parties. This agreement is referred to as an agency agreement and delineates the roles and responsibilities of both the licensee and the client. If a licensee is representing a buyer, the agreement is referred to as a buyer-agency agreement. If a licensee is representing a seller, the agency agreement is typically included in the listing agreement. The agency agreement must be signed before the client enters into any sort of binding agreement. For example, a buyer must sign an agency agreement before the buyer signs a purchase contract. The same applies to a listing agreement and a seller. The subsequent binding agreement, such as a purchase agreement or a lease agreement, must include a provision for the client to acknowledge the agency relationship into which they have entered through a written agency agreement. Limited agency. A licensee may be representing both the buyer and the seller at the same time. Such representation requires the informed consent from both the buyer and the seller. Informed consent consists of the buyer and seller acknowledging in writing that the representation arrangement has been explained to them. A licensee may not act as a limited agent if the licensee is a principal in the transaction, or if the licensee is an officer, director, partner, member, employee, or stockholder in any entity which is a principal in the transaction. If a licensee is a principal in a transaction or affiliated with the principal in a transaction, the other party must either have their own representation or go without representation. The principal or licensee may not represent the other party in any way. Subagency. The listing agent on a property obviously represents the seller. In Utah, the listing agent typically cooperates with the agent representing the buyer. Often, the listing agent agrees to split the commission being paid by the seller with the agent representing the buyer. The buyer's agent represents the buyer during the transaction, and the listing agent represents the seller. Without the cooperation we just mentioned, a different agency or representation situation exists. If the listing agent is not willing to officially cooperate, the buyer's agent must actually become a sub-agent of the listing broker. If this happens, the buyer is without representation. Both agents typically represent the seller. Please note, this is not how real estate is typically practiced in Utah. However, the rule still covers some requirements for sub-agency. If a licensee wishes to become a sub-agent, they must do the following. Obtain the permission from the principal broker with whom they are affiliated. Notify the listing brokerage that sub-agency is requested. Enter into a written agreement with the listing broker. Obtain information regarding the subject property.